Hey everyone, Pete here from Anden. We have a brand new EP out right now on Zerothree Music made up of 2 tracks, Flicker and Escalus. Huge thanks to everyone who's supported the EP so far. It's been really exciting for us to see it getting such a positive response. And in this video, I want to talk a little bit about how we made the second track on the EP, Escalus. This is more of a deep progressive track, a little bit darker, so maybe a little bit different than what we're normally doing. And so it was just a lot of fun to make. And the sound that I want to talk about is something that's pretty important to the Anden sound in general, and something that we are using in our tracks in one way or another pretty regularly. So I'll just quickly play a little snippet of the track and then show you the sound that we're going to be recreating. Cool, so we're going to be doing this sound, which, as you can see with our incredibly advanced naming convention here, is the pluck drone thing. But yeah, it's this kind of like sustained drone sound that we are using in a lot of our tracks. So for this sound, we are using Diva. It's a soft synth made by UHE, a really great synth that we're using pretty regularly. So I'll start just by stripping away the processing, and so this is just the synth to begin with. So again, this kind of sound is something that we're doing in a lot of our tracks. It's this kind of like sustained sound playing the root note of the key of the track we're in, and then there's some kind of like cool pitch stuff going on within the sound itself. So to make this sound, we're using 2 oscillators. What this means is that it's 2 separate types of sound waves that we're creating from the synthesizer. We're going to put them together and do some processing to create the final sound. So the first sound that we are using within the synth is just a typical saw wave. So that on its own, not super exciting. And the second sound we're using is a pulse wave. Also not on its own super exciting, but the interesting thing about these 2 sounds is that they're actually playing different pitches. So the second oscillator is tuned up 7 semitones, meaning that it's 7 notes on our piano higher than the original oscillator. And so it's creating this 5th chord, which is something that gives the sound a lot of richness and warmth just from the get-go. And also by combining 2 different waveforms, we're just adding a little bit more of an interesting character to the sound. So this is where we're starting in terms of a sound source. Now those sounds are going into our filter section where we're creating, or we're controlling the different frequencies in the sound. So what you can see here is that the filter cutoff, which is the main control here, is actually kind of in the middle of that slider. But that's going to be changing throughout the course of the track. So we can see here that actually at the very beginning of the track, that sound is a lot more closed. It's darker, all lower frequencies. And then it's only later in the track do we get more of those high frequencies. And we can actually see here that that filter cutoff is moving 100% of the time when the sound is playing in the track. So this is already adding a lot of movement and life. And that's something that I think is really important for electronic music, that getting this constant movement and this humanization to sounds so they don't sound stale and stagnant and ultimately like they were actually made on a computer. So that's something we're trying to avoid here. So we have that constant filter movement, and if we go back into the synth, we're doing 2 more kind of interesting things in this filter section using the 2 LFOs here. So the first LFO is creating our stabbing sounds here. So if we were just turn this off, we just have our sustained synth sound. But by adding the LFO to this filter cutoff, we're getting that kind of stabbing. And this is just created over here where we've designed this sort of saw wave, which is giving us that pluck, and it's going on every 8th note. So it's 2 times per beat in the track. And then secondly, we have another LFO, which is just some random movement on this filter cutoff. So if I turn off the first one and we only listen here just at a pretty extreme level, This is just, again, randomly changing the cutoff of this sound. So it sounds pretty aggressive just on its own, but if we mix that in very slightly with the rest of the controls here, we get this kind of constant movement to the filter cutoff. It's completely random. And so again, it's just this more movement and life to the sound that we're trying to create. And then really the last thing we're doing is just adding in a little bit of reverb. This is something actually that we do pretty rarely in synths in terms of actually adding reverb and delay into the synth itself. Usually we would do that kind of at the end as like a separate effect once we've processed the sound, but here it sounded good and so we stuck with it. So that's it for the sound design there. So let's go to the actual processing now. The first plugin we're using is a Shep 73. This is Waves' emulation of a Neve 1073 preamp. This is a great plugin for adding warmth and saturation, and we really like putting this preamp plugins at the beginning of our chains when we're using soft synths because it just makes them sound a little bit more kind of like analog gear. The really cool thing about the Neve is that you can process your left and right channels separately, and so that's actually something we're doing here. So within our EQ controls, we're actually going to EQ these channels in different ways. And so because we're treating the left and right channels differently, your brain is going to perceive that as a wider sound, like whatever's coming out of your left speaker and your right speaker, or your left earphone and your right earphone. Those are actually different sounds. And so your brain is going to perceive the sound as a wider sound in total. So here, with these three controls here, we're EQing these separately. You can actually just hear the sound to get wider. And so then between the preamp settings and the EQs, because we are treating them differently, we're creating slightly different volumes in our left and right channel, which we're then kind of compensating for in our input volume here. So the final sound that we get is a little bit more balanced. And then also in the final version of the track, I just panned the whole sound just a touch right. So we're just getting more warmth, saturation, but also width in this sound now with the Neve. Universal Audio has a really good emulation of the Neve preamp as well, but here we're just using the Waves one. Next, adding in Soundtoys Decapitator. Nothing fancy here, but this is just more saturation, more warmth, and we're actually mixing it in parallel, so it's only about 30% wet here, meaning that 70% of the sound is going to be untouched by this plugin, and only 30% is actually getting affected by the settings we have here. So nothing huge there, but again, just a little bit more warmth, a little bit more saturation. Next, we're doing some EQ just to tame the kind of lows and low mids that we just added in with these first two plugins. And the majority of the EQ work we would do probably later on once we're done with the actual production and we're moving just to do the mixing part of the track. And then finally, we're adding in some sidechain to the sound in 2 layers. So the first layer is actually just a tremolo that I've hooked up to kind of act like a sidechain. And here, whenever our kick is hitting, we're just completely turning off the volume to the sound. So that's just going to help us a little bit from a mix perspective and help the kick come through a little bit more. And then we're adding a second layer of sidechain, which is more of a traditional kind of on-off pump. And so that's playing off that 8th note stab in the original sound. And so it's just giving it kind of more groove, more pump. And so that's kind of between these 2 layers, we're getting all of the sidechain that we're looking for. The last thing, which you're probably hearing throughout the course of the demo here, is that we are getting some pitch movement in the sound. Rather than actually automating the full pitch, we're only going to be automating the second oscillator, so that pulse wave oscillator within the original synth. Here, we're doing this because it allows us to maintain that kind of root note foundation to the sound, but still get the pitch movement. So when I click play here, you can actually see when this jumps up. You can watch the detune here on oscillator 2. That just moves a little bit. And so again, that's kind of giving us a sort of pitch movement, just a little bit more life, a little bit more differentiation to the sounds. And so between that, the filter cutoff, and then all of these like analog style plugins we're using, we're getting, even though it's a digitally created sound, it has the life, movement, and warmth that you might find in more of a true analog sound. So now if we throw that back in with the rest of the track. That's creating a pretty important foundation from a melodic perspective, but also from a rhythmic perspective for a lot of these other instruments to sit on top of. So hopefully, if you're a producer, you learned something. If you're not a producer, this was still interesting and cool to follow along. Thank you again to everyone for the support on the EP. If you haven't listened yet, both the tracks are available over on Spotify. If you'd like to support by purchasing or downloading, that's available over on Beatport. Thanks again for watching, and we'll catch you guys soon.